Hey everyone, I just wanted to make an extended video for the GEEKOM GeekBook X16 Pro considering its gaming capabilities after finishing my full review of it the other day. I know, it's not meant for gaming in the first place, but well, who can stop us, right? Well, thanks to its Meteor Lake Intel CPU and relatively strong iGPU on the level of a Radeon 780M paired with no less than 32GB of pretty fast DDR5 7500 megatransfer RAM, it is very usable for casual gaming and even some AAA gaming if you're not too sophisticated. Today I'm testing the higher end version with the Intel Core Ultra 9 185H, and it won't make much difference if you're using the 14-inch version instead because it has the same CPU, RAM and TDP. Though the cheaper Core Ultra 5 125H versions will most likely be around maybe 10 to 20% slower for gaming, despite also having 32GB of RAM, which is pretty nice. All of today's tested games have been recorded via an external capture card to prevent performance loss using the laptop's performance mode, and the games are presented in alphabetical order as always. I was mostly using 1200p as a resolution, which is a slightly lower 16:10 aspect ratio than the laptop's native resolution, but it still fits the Geekbook's monitor. Oh, and as you can see here, I was also testing all the games plugged in, while unplugging the laptop only reduces the FPS by roughly 10% or so. And if I wasn't getting 60 FPS already, I was mostly using low settings and also XeSS or FSR as well. And now let's jump right into the benchmarks. I tested the new Anno 117 with the low preset at 1200p and XeSS unbalanced. Overall, that seemed to be doable just okay, while it's starting to become slightly blurry. Though XeSS balanced is more comparable to FSR performance. However, I saw around 30 to 40 FPS most of the time, gave me an average of 36 FPS in the end. Pretty stable overall, but I was getting a weird texture bug where the textures, well, just kind of refused to load, and so I had to switch to medium first and then later to high to actually see any textures. I don't know, probably issues with the Intel graphic drivers again, and that's, to be honest, not very surprising to me, but I mean, it is playable in general. The currently very popular ARC Raiders ran quite well at a slightly lower than native resolution of 1200p as long as I used low settings and XeSS set to performance. I know that might cause some people physical pain, but honestly on a 16-inch screen I think it's totally fine. On the Blue Gate and Buried City maps I averaged around 59 FPS with 1% lows between 30 and 40 FPS. That's, to be honest, quite playable, especially for a brand new high-profile title. But the game is pretty well optimized in my opinion in general, so let's jump right to the next game. I have always been critical about the pure performance of Assassin's Creed Shadows, probably the worst running game of today's video. I just think that the performance and the graphical presentation don't quite match, as in we're not getting enough FPS for how the game looks. And I actually had to drop the resolution to 800p, including XeSS unbalanced, in combination with the very low preset to get somewhat playable FPS with an average of only 34 though. And I have to give it to the game very good 1% lows of 27, which is 80% of the average FPS. Very stable frame times. But the game kinda looks terrible, to be honest. You can almost count the pixels and it's quite blurry, really. For Baldurs Gate 3 I was testing Act 1 at 1200p with medium settings and XeSS unbalanced again. You could probably tinker around a bit since that game is basically okay with 30 FPS as well for a lot of people, I guess, because it's not real time, you know. However, I was getting around 42 FPS on average with 1% lows of only 18 FPS on the outside areas. Weird frame time graph, seems like something was quite off, but should be playable nevertheless. Once inside that goblin dungeon thingy in Act 1, the FPS went up to around 55 to 60-ish. A quick round of CS2 on Dust 2 against bots using low settings and FSR, again at 1200p. This runs exceptionally well with a very high 145 FPS on average for an iGPU, stable frame times and 1% lows of 79 FPS. And hey, here you can actually make proper use of the 120Hz display in that game. That's quite impressive. I also tested GTA 5 Enhanced at high settings in 1200p. combined with FSR set to quality. It looked really good and delivered a very playable average of around 47 to 50 FPS with excellent 1% lows of 38 FPS. Once again, you can see that even in this older game, the system often reserves more than 16 or 18 GB of memory, and if you wanted, you could easily reach 60 FPS by slightly lowering the settings. Also keep in mind that 1200p is a bit higher than 1080p, and I chose this resolution because of the laptop's 16:10 aspect ratio. For Cyberpunk 2077, I was using the low preset at 1200p with XeSS on quality, resulting in around 43 FPS on average, though the 1% lows have been way too low with only around 10 FPS due to constant micro stutters, as you can see right here in the frame time graph. Something seemed to be a bit off most of the time, could be playable with more optimization, maybe XeSS on balance plus an FPS cap. Well, I mean, as you can see, it runs and all, it's just not that optimal, I guess. What do you think? I mean, it still looks pretty good for an iGPU and especially on a 16-inch screen. Blizzard's Diablo 4 worked perfectly fine with the medium preset even, at 1200p with XeSS on quality, around 59 FPS on average with 1% lows of 43 FPS. Not many complaints here, a few hiccups from time to time, in area switches and when bosses appear, etc. But the frame time drops a bit in heavier fights, but still, I mean, there is actually some headroom left for even more FPS by further dropping the settings or amplifying XeSS, but that was a good experience and you could easily enjoy the game that way for like even a more professional approach, I guess. Elden Ring was playable okay at 1200p with the low preset, which kinda gets a bit blurry and all, but I'd probably take the FPS over a higher graphics quality. Around 46 to 48 FPS on average and 1% lows seemed okay with around 35 FPS. Doable but not perfect, and yeah, one could finish the game that way for sure, considering the original Dark Souls 1 was restricted to 30 FPS if I'm not mistaken. So overall, I'd consider that one of the more positive results for today. With Fortnite, the GeekBook X16 can actually make use of the 120Hz screen, since I got an average of 115 FPS using the performance mode with Epic View Distance activated and low settings at 1200p and 100% resolution scaling. The 32GB of fast DDR5 RAM really come in handy here, and frame times etc. have been surprisingly good. And even in the very first round I was testing the game, decent 1% lows of 77 FPS support that statement. If you're okay with 60 FPS and prefer better graphics, you could of course use the normal DirectX mode instead. By the way, as shown earlier in the video, Forza Horizon 5 ran fine as well at 1200p with medium settings, around 61 FPS on average with 1% lows of 51 FPS. And while that is perfectly playable and all, in case you wonder, yes, it usually runs better on AMD iGPUs compared to that. Just like AC Shadows and Cyberpunk 2077, Hogwarts Legacy is one of the more demanding AAA games for today's video. At 1200p, I had to use the low preset with XeSS on balanced to get around 40 FPS on average and 1% lows of 27 FPS. It is playable, but it's not optimal, and at 40 FPS I can already feel the lower input lag, which results in turning around too far or not far enough from time to time, etc. Well, if you know, you know. Playable for some, not really playable for others. Again, depends on what you expect. Well, I usually expect a lot from Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and usually I actually do get a lot. A lot of FPS for a modern AAA game on an iGPU. 1200p with the low preset and XeSS on balanced gave me a pretty neat average of 55 FPS and 1% lows of 43. I think this is a pretty good experience for a non-gaming laptop with pretty great graphics for an iGPU if you ask me, for a game that offers around 100 hours of gameplay for most people. Well, of course, Megabonk runs just perfectly fine, even with the highest possible settings at 1200p, but you know, that game kinda runs on a toaster. I just wanted to make sure that people that are not that familiar with PC performance, etc. Now know that as well. For the Viking survival indie game Valheim, I was using 1200p plus auto upscaling, which looks a bit smoother, etc. But okay on the 16-inch screen. And that way, even with medium settings, I got around 76 FPS on average with 1% loss of 43. If you're willing to sacrifice a few FPS, you could easily get a sharper image at around 45 to 55 FPS instead, if you'd prefer that. However, the game is absolutely playable on the GeekBook X16 and the Core Ultra 9 185H. Not the easiest indie game, despite the voxel pixelated look. And for Valorant, I was once again using 1200p with low settings for the best performance, and that actually ran pretty great with around 215 FPS on average. And now the 1% lows have been pretty low, and I honestly don't know why, because I didn't feel any stuttering whatsoever. It ran pretty great and even far beyond the refresh rate of the GeekBook's display. But such easier esport titles definitely are no problem for the GeekBooks. Very enjoyable in my opinion, maybe even for more sophisticated players in that case. And you know, besides what I've shown here today, there are basically thousands of games that will run well to more than perfect on GEEKOM's GeekBooks, whether it's the faster Core Ultra 9 or the Core Ultra 5 versions. Like probably anything up until 2020 and earlier without even thinking about it. Of course, basically all esport titles, stuff like Minecraft and World of Warcraft, Trackmania, Apex Legends, PUBG, Rocket League, The Witcher, etc. It all depends on what you expect, but especially older and lighter titles usually can do 60 FPS or even more. But of course, very modern AAA titles with heavy graphics like AC Shadows, Indiana Jones, Oblivion Remastered or Cyberpunk won't just run as good. Then again, it's not a gaming laptop by any means, unless you only plan to play lighter games, lighter titles casually, then it actually could become your gaming laptop, I guess. Because that is always a question of perspective. And well, it's a fact that this laptop is just as fast as the first MSI Claw gaming handheld, so you know. If you want to check out the GeekBook X16 yourself, make sure to use the link in the description and my discount code HUBX16CALL for 10% off. And that's all for today's video. If you like the content, feel free to like the video and or even subscribe to the channel for more laptop, mini PC and gaming handheld related content. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.